Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, Sandy. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the U.S. and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping other human beings. In this podcast, we will share our insights, our experiences, and our knowledge in the hopes of inspiring leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
So today we're going to share an organizing framework from our model, Creating Presence, that we found really helpful for planning interventions for the people we serve, but also for structuring problem solving and even organizing supervision.
Yeah, it's called SELF. And the word is used as an acronym. I've become crazy about acronyms. I don't know.
You love a good acronym.
A good acronym. There's nothing like it. So SELF stands for safety, emotions, loss, and future. And it's a way of organizing conversations in what we have to think of as a non-linear and a non-hierarchical and a non-blaming way, using language that really isn't dependent on a whole lot of professional jargon. Yeah. And I ought to share, I think, how it originated. We had a psychiatric inpatient unit beginning in 1980. And around 1985, we started to realize that pretty much everybody had what now we would call complex PTSD, but there was no term for it now. Then. So there was a time in the beginning to really work with people who had multiple very painful issues and symptoms. But then in the 1980s, funding began to be cut and was cut over and over and over. So anybody close to my age can remember there was a time where you really could do treatment in an inpatient setting. It's become difficult, if not impossible, today. But the result of that change, the changes in funding, was that we were continually under pressure to do more and more with less and less. So we had to figure out how to get the maximal amount of information conveyed to each other, importantly, in the shortest time possible. And that's really why SELF emerged, because it became like a compass. The image that I use to explain it is that it's a compass. And you change direction. So the 4 points on the compass are SELF. And it helps you negotiate to maneuver through what is really a jungle of despair and frustration that people encounter. So it represents the 4 categories that really define the most significant impairments and problems that people face when they've been exposed to trauma and adversity. And along the way, it really helps you figure out how to measure healing, how to kind of gauge whether people are making the changes that they need to make. Because traumatized people usually struggle in some way with their own safety, and all too frequently with the safety of other people as well. That's
why the S stands for safety.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. And then the E is because most people who have experienced trauma and adversity have trouble managing their emotions. And because their own emotions are so confusing, they often tend to misread the emotions of other people. So that whole issue of emotional management becomes critical. And then the piece we found kind of later in the process of our own evolution was that people couldn't get better unless they dealt with loss. And not only the losses that they had already experienced, but what they were going to have to give up in order to change, to get healthier, which is huge. And if you don't deal with that, people can't move on. And then the F was for the sense of future. Like, why change? Why move on? Why go through all this when it's so hard to do? Well, you have to have some vision of the future that is different, that you want to get to. And that became another critical element in this compass. And I bet you have a good example of using this.
I do. So, when we think about that compass, that's safety, emotions, loss, and future, it's so simple, right? The language is so simple. And so often when we are, thinking about complex trauma, it's complex, and we can start to feel really overwhelmed by the magnitude of people's experiences, the magnitude of their suffering and their symptoms. And so, I love the image of the compass, but because I'm in toddler mom mode, I always sorting toys are really big in my house right now, right? So I really like the analogy too of thinking of it as just a way to organize things. So, my little ones have those boxes with, like a square and a triangle and a circle and a rectangle as little holes. And then they have all the shapes in pieces, and they put them in and sort them. And I really think about self that way too. It's a way of kind of looking at a big mess and figuring out how to make sense of it. And these four categories of safety, emotions, loss, and future really they're accessible. Like, people get that in a very visceral way. And we don't have to use fancy words or my family sometimes accuses me of using therapy language at home, right? They're like, stop therapizing me. That's like my daughter's favorite thing to say. So in that way, it's also like, it's not therapizing. It's really just organizing. And I think, to give a good example, one comes from an organization that I was doing some coaching with. And this was the team. They were a small team of leaders and doing really big work, but there were originally four of them, and one of the team members left, and there was a lot of drama around that leaving, and there had been a lot of conflict within that team. And they made a decision to hire someone else in a different kind of role, something that they hadn't had before. And the executive director of that team um, used self as a way of thinking about the hiring process. And they went through a number of interviews, and they narrowed their choices down to a couple of candidates. And then he felt, you know, sort of unsure about what the right decision was, and what they needed to consider. And so he sat down and wrote down his thoughts and organized his thoughts in the self framework. And what he wrote, and I'll share that he was sort of reflecting on their past experience of the team. And around safety, he said, right now, to have someone who's egocentric or not trauma informed could really thwart the momentum that we've built. And we've started to establish moral, psychological, social, emotional, and spiritual safety within our team. And so, in order to protect the team and create further safety, we need to really evaluate, what this person, not just what this person can bring in terms of their work experience and their capacity, but also how they're going to engage and relate with the rest of us. And I thought that was really helpful. Go ahead.
Really helpful and really um, elaborates on what we mean by safety,
Yes.
right? Because people often just hear it as physical safety, but
Exactly.
actually in the workplace, that's often the least big problem. And
Absolutely.
that's what he was doing, was organizing around those other domains of safety.
Yes. Yes. For emotions, he wrote, we must also ensure that we're really mindful of the emotions and feelings of all the applicants, because the job hiring process is a vulnerable one. And we also have to attend to the emotions of our team members because they're going to be establishing new relationships with this person. And so they had some conversations about what feelings had come up for them in the past in the team as it was before. And, some of the ways that those emotions enhanced the work, some of the ways that those emotions interfered with the work. And they made a commitment as a team to make a like create a process of allowing themselves to be vulnerable in the interviews in the same way that they were asking the candidates to. And
And so important, because it's often what we look at somebody's CV, we look at what their qualifications are, and ignore our own intuition, ignore the interactive feelings that are coming up, and lose all that emotional wisdom as a result. So again, it compels, using the E compels you to really think widely about emotional intelligence.
yes, and it also, I think, for this team, allowed them to really tap into um, some self-awareness around inherent bias and their emotional reactions to people who might have been different from them. And this was a team that had a reasonable gender split, but was very white. And that was part of the conversation that they had as well. And sort of talking about, their emotions as the catalyst for also talking about any potential bias that might
Sure.
have come into the hiring practice, I think really enriched the conversations too. With L for loss, he wrote, with wonderful candidates come wonderful possibilities. And the stories that we tell ourselves about what any candidate could be also create a loss simply because we can only hire one. And through the work and the impact of the work, we have at times felt it was too much to bear, and we're emerging from that stronger. But it's also really important to honor that I, as the leader, am going to miss aspects of this time that will never come back, right? What we were and what we are now will not ever be again when we add a new person. It also gave them an opportunity to talk about, well, what happens, the person that I feel most strongly about hiring is not the person that we ultimately choose. How will we manage the emotions, but also, the loss around that?
And
So
what if the
that became
person that we really want decides not
doesn't
to
want,
come?
yeah, doesn't want to be right. And then for future, he said, the first step in this process is to hire someone who can meet us in the moment that we're currently in and who can grow with us into what we will become. And I thought that was just so beautifully said. And there is not necessarily a right or wrong option, but we have to ensure coordination. And I think that really shifted the conversation too, because it wasn't setting it up as like, what's important is that we hire the right person, like we make the right choice, and creating this binary where like there's a right decision and a wrong decision. What he placed at the forefront was our team needs to collaborate, and this process needs to be right for all of us. And we'll get to a right place by doing this well. And they did
It's
end up making a decision, and
making a
it
good
was a great
decision.
one.
And it's
Yeah.
so interesting how often people don't take the time to envision what they want to get to. So if you can't envision it, how are you going to get there? You're just going to stumble on it.
Right.
So it really is really important. We learned we had to, in order to help people to really commit themselves to the process of recovery from trauma, they had to imagine a future where they weren't so bogged down in trauma.
Absolutely. And you're actually raising the point that it's not always important to do this in the order, right? The acronym is lovely because it spells self, but that doesn't mean that we have to start with safety. And as a clinician, when I was using self with clients, patients, what I found was that a lot of the people I worked with were not invested at all in their own safety. And so we would spend hours and sessions and weeks and months creating safety plans and like, trying to convince people that it was important to be safe. And that was exhausting and fruitless. When we switched the acronym and actually started with F, because what we found was that in my program, at least, the kids who had the least sense of connection to a future were the ones that had the most problems with safety.
Mhm.
That if we helped them borrow a vision sometimes of safety or borrow a vision for the future from us, and help them really generate their own, that actually impacted their safety, right?
Yeah,
Same with loss and future. We don't always have to start with establishing safety. And I think that's a fallacy that we sometimes buy into.
right.
But in thinking about, what it means to recover at the personal level or at the team level or at the organizational level, what we see is that recovery really means we have a restored sense of safety and we're able to manage our feelings. We're able to integrate losses in ways that give them their proper due, but those losses don't overwhelm us and constantly haunt us in the present, and a sense of empowerment to shape their futures. And, we know that this applies to individuals and in therapy, and we know that this applies to teams. It applies to organizations as well. And part of our implementation process for creating presence involves taking a like pretty deep assessment of the organization's safety. And we look at safety in 5 categories: physical, psychological, social, moral, and cultural. And we're going to talk about what those assessments look like, kind of give you a broad view of
Let's
how we.
start with what people are most familiar with, physical safety, right? So the commitment to physical safety in an organization really encourages a broad definition of nonviolence. So policies exist for reducing any kind of coercive practices. So in some settings, that might be physical restraint or isolation or threats of such, but it also can mean all kinds of um, management techniques that actually are pretty violent towards people. So shaming, humiliating, embarrassing, not teaching, expecting people to just know. You have to have a broad definition of what violence means and what nonviolence means. It encourages self-care. Physical safety means we are all responsible for taking care of ourselves. But at the organizational level, then the organization has to look at, well, what demands are you really expecting of people? Overtime, on call. Do they have time to sleep? Do they have time to rest, to eat, to take breaks? All those things have to be considered in scheduling in an organization. And then health. It encourages just basic healthy practices, from cleaning to how is food stored that's available for the staff, opportunities for breaks and being able to get up and sit down, and bathroom access and all those basic functions that we need. There also needs to be ongoing awareness of whatever risks do exist in the environment, whatever dangers are actually there. So from everything from spaces being clean and neat and well maintained and well lit to who is in the environment, and is there some kind of danger that we need to know about that person or that's in that person's life. It always makes me think of, being aware of domestic violence situations that are so common, and that might have people in the workplace who are victims of that, and that could be dangerous. And then basic physical safety also includes financial security. So having to look at issues of compensation and benefits, and are they really adequate to support employees' living expenses? And reliability, right? How reliable is the organization in responses to any kind of violation of any kind of safety, and repairing problems in the physical environment, not letting the environment become a danger in and of itself. So those are all aspects of physical safety at an organizational level that need to be taken into account, that are very basic in kind of the foundation. And then there's psychological safety.
And in that one, we're really looking at the capacity for self-protection. So not just, what do we do if someone is physically injured, but how do we respond when someone is psychologically injured, when there's been, violation of trust, or even things like, do people feel safe walking from the parking lot into the building? Humor is part of psychological safety, and respectful, good-natured humor is what we're looking for.
Very important. That's what triggers our parasympathetic nervous system, that calms us down, is laughter and having fun.
Attention and focus is a kind of psychological safety. And this, I think, really looks at, do we give people too many things to do at one time? Like, are we overloading people and asking for too much? Around self-efficacy and empowerment, we're really looking at, how do we minimize micromanagement? That's a big complaint that staff members often have. Self-esteem is part of psychological safety. We look for recognition and highlighting and supporting good work. Self-control and self-discipline is about having structure and rules, consequences, and responses that are really well articulated. Creativity and initiative means, there are opportunities for staff to try new things without excessive layers of approval. And curiosity. People can talk about whatever they need to talk about, and there aren't things that are off limits. Another example, I think, is around gatekeeping. Unduly limited access to leadership. That reminds me of an example of a CEO that I worked with who had 2 executive assistants, and their desks were right outside of his door, and you had to walk, they had to get up and let you in to get access. Like, that really sent a message.
Yeah, sure did. And it wasn't a message about social safety.
No, it wasn't.
Social safety encourages a lot of support through regular supervision and the ability to consult with other people and have team meetings, get together and interact with other people on the staff, formally and informally. It's a huge problem during the pandemic when people just couldn't do that. Having security, having social safety in the environment where there's a clarity of role and a connection to successes are really well articulated. Having good boundaries of work assignments and workload distribution, having compassion, that it's a compassionate environment when there are bad things happening to people and their families. Valuing assertive behavior, that complaints or recommendations are actually addressed, not ignored, and there are formal conflict resolution protocols.
For moral safety, what
That's
we're
harder
really,
to talk about.
yeah, it is. But I think things like honesty, when there are ethical dilemmas, how those are acknowledged and resolved, how mistakes are treated, whether people feel there's justice in how errors are addressed. Distributive and procedural justice, that basically means like how resources are allocated, and how consistent the protocols are, right? So is there one response for someone at this level of the organization versus a response, somebody might get fired if they do the same thing, but they're at a different level of the organization. Self-awareness, which is about feedback, being able to give feedback and not encountering defensiveness. Expressions of identity, which are really about tolerance. And, this comes up a lot around dress codes and, how dissent is treated, and knowledge. Do people have the information they need in order to do their work effectively?
Cultural safety it's really all about all the focus that's been on DEIJ work now is really about trying to create environments that are more culturally safe, regardless of what your identity is. And that means respectful communication, avoiding microaggression and stereotypes, recognizing that othering that often happens automatically. We're so accustomed to that. Being able to have a two-way dialogue when problems do arise, and having culturally specific services that really respect culture and race and class and ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, physical disability, all the problems that go along with othering. So we just took a detailed look at how we assess for safety in an organization. I want to highlight that there are 4 components: safety, emotions, loss, and future. And why don't we take a break?
Great. Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, Sandy and I will talk more about using the self framework as an organizing structure. We'll be right back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. We're going to continue our discussion about using the acronym SELF to organize conversations in a trauma-informed way. We're going to talk about how we use SELF in the context of supervision. And we're going to explain parallel process, what it actually means.
Yeah, and the reason that we are going to talk about parallel process is because it's really important to recognize that in our conversations in supervision, most of the time, at least for me as a clinical supervisor, we sort of use one-on-one meetings to talk about the work, right? It's sort of this rote experience of people showing up and saying like, okay, I want to update you on this project, or I want to update you on the, how this patient is. And that's useful, but I think it's not enough. And it doesn't really create an opportunity for trauma-informed practice. So what I've been doing, and what we are doing in creating presence, is helping supervisors and managers really think about self as a way of organizing supervision conversations. And that doesn't mean that, every time someone comes in, we go through safety, emotions, loss, and future. But we have these possibilities, topics that are available to us that we may not typically talk about. And so I created this chart, and on the columns, or the rows, like on down the left side, it's S, E, L, and F, and across the top we look at service-centered conversations, staff-centered conversations, and organization-centered conversations. And I think this has been really helpful because most of the time meetings are really just about service-centered topics.
And when you're
And
talking about supervision, which is very much a clinical term, you're also really talking about management, right?
absolutely,
Managing anything. Could be managing a post office. And the
yes,
same kinds of issues, if you're going to be trauma informed, are going to arise, right? So
absolutely.
the notion of parallel process is really important for people to understand because they're experiencing it all the time without necessarily having a word for it. It means when two or more systems have significant relationships with one another, they tend to develop similar thoughts and feelings and behaviors. So, for example, when one person is really stressed, everybody in the family feels it. When many families are stressed, then it's going to come out in some way in the whole community. When there are many, many very stressed or traumatized people in the workforce, then the whole organization will run in parallel. Everybody will be feeling that because of emotional contagion. That's normal in the human species. So in living beings, what we need to finally, eventually recognize is that everything is connected to and interacting and therefore paralleling everything else. And so in clinical work, this produces complex interactions between very traumatized clients, very stressed staff, pressured organizations, and the overall social and economic environment that we're all struggling with.
And going back to thinking about this concept of using team meetings or supervision or management meetings as an opportunity to think about parallel process, we want to be aware that we may have something going on with somebody that we serve, and that's coming up over and over and over again. But the solution to shifting that may actually be in one of the other areas. It may be with the staff person themselves, or it might be more of a programmatic or organizational issue. And that's so real because that parallel means that what's happening in our organizations can influence what's happening with the people that we're serving, what's
I have an
happening with
example.
us.
I have a good example of that
Yeah, go give it.
happened to me. So we had just the managers, as managers, we had just found out that we were going to have to move our program. And that was going to mean leaving a lot of the staff behind. But we had not told anybody else yet. And we went into a meeting with all of our staff to go over all of our patients. And it was everything was wrong. It was everything, everybody was messing up. All the patients were acting out. It was just awful. And we fortunately had a visiting nurse from England at the time. And she said, excuse me, but didn't you just get some news that's pretty disturbing? And we stopped talking about the patients and we started talking about how we were all feeling about this major change that was going to happen. And all of the problems in the patients stopped after that.
Right.
And, so there are all these unconscious forces and feelings that are going on in every environment that we just don't pay attention to, but that can be really toxic.
Yeah, and as a result of that, the systems that we work in, and we've talked about this, can inadvertently replicate the very experiences that have been so toxic for the people that we're supposed to be helping. And depending on where you work, it can look different. If the organization itself is, really overwhelmed, there are lots of things going on, then we're going to see the staff members also feeling overwhelmed. And we're likely to see that our patients or clients are going to feel and show us the behaviors that align with being overwhelmed. So it's really helpful to not just look at the people that we're serving as if they are replaceable parts, right? If they're operating in a vacuum, we want to think too about what's happening in the context of our own lives as people who are helping and what's happening in our programs or in our organizations, because that is also affecting what's happening to the people that we serve.
And that's
really
often, and that's often what is ignored or missed is the context, because we're hurried. We're in a hurry. We got to get all this done really fast. There's all kinds of pressure. And so we don't step back and look at, well, what else might be going on here? And so we often then, what happens under those circumstances is that environments often become increasingly punitive and aggressive, and it makes everything worse.
So that's why when we're using self, we really want to think about that organization, team-oriented conversation. But we also need to think about what's happening for the individual staff person. And we used to, there was like a golden age where therapists could really talk about their own internal experience. That's not a thing. Now we talk about productivity, right?
I think that's called countertransference, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. You want me to define that? What that is?
Yeah, would you?
It's really not, it's a fancy term, but actually it's our own emotional reactions to the person that we're with, that we're working with, that we're talking with that we're supervising. And it is often really valuable as the term arose, because it's really valuable because it provides information. What you feel gives you information about the other person. But the tricky part is it may also be providing you information about your own stuff, your own biases, your own issues, your own triggers. And that's part of the good work of good psychotherapy, is trying to figure that all out and sort it out. But most people are not in those kinds of environments where there's any time or respect for understanding those kinds of reactions that happen everywhere, not just in the therapy room. They happen with everybody we encounter. So recognizing and managing those reactions and our own stuff requires first understanding how we put together our personal and professional identities. And that's a pretty broad idea, because that includes our heritage, our first language, our country of origin. It may also include factors like gender and sexual orientation and age and marital status and whether or not we're parents, and our professional and economic status. And then the whole issue of cultural identity. It may include qualities that are important to who we are, that come from our families or our origins or from our communities. So race and age and gender and professional training, and again, country of origin, first language, all of those relational status, who we are, how we identify ourselves, including our sexual orientation and our religion.
So kind of having that self-awareness puts us in a better position to create connections. And that helps build better working relationships between supervisors and managers and the staff that they're working with. But that's not always enough. And sometimes there are real barriers to creating effective supervisory relationships. I mean, some of the things that I've seen in my coaching with our creating presence sites and also in my own experience are, there are differing levels of expertise. Sometimes people are supervising people who are from a different discipline and using a completely different, orientation for how they do the work. There are issues around power dynamics. There are sometimes issues around emotion regulation, right? I've had supervisees who are like constantly overwhelmed, maybe, sometimes really demanding, or on the opposite end, like really disengaged. Sometimes there are differences in their skills and knowledge. Their lack of confidence, they're crisis driven. Sometimes they're really overconfident. Sometimes there's limited insight. And so the self framework can be really helpful, especially that area, like that column that looks at like staff focused topics and looking at emotions specifically, where we can start to kind of tease that out and identify areas of strength and areas of challenge. But sometimes I think too, supervision or team meetings, management, conversations can turn into like complaint sessions. I've had that happen too. And so one of the things that we've created is 5-question response for supervisors when they feel like, oh my goodness, this is kind of just turning into a complaint session. Asking like, do you just need me to listen, be a sounding board? Do you need me to help you brainstorm? Or do you need me to take some action? Right? Like kind of framing, what does this person need or want from me? And then that helps you know where to go. The other questions are really about kind of creating accountability. What's your plan for resolving this, right? So this complaint keeps coming up and coming up and coming up, and I can help or I can listen, but what's the plan for resolving this? And I think this kind of goes back to that future part of self that's so important, because often we get stuck. So these questions really help reorganize us in that way. And then what outcome are you hoping for? Also really connected to future. Like what's the expectation that you have?
In those places where people get stuck, it's often because the group is unwilling or unable at that point in time to deal with what they're going to have to give up to change. That's where the L in self comes in. If you're a supervisor, you don't have to bring it up, but you can know that in your own head that we are stuck, and what we're stuck at is we got to make change, and it's going to be uncomfortable.
Yes. And sometimes just using the terms is an intervention. Like I find there are so many times when I'm having conversations with my team where, there's all of this stuff, and I will just say, yeah, this is a loss. We're dealing with a loss.
Right.
And that just shifts the focus, right?
Right.
Naming what this is gives us a different, it's like changing the compass.
Right.
Now we have a different direction. We can talk about this differently.
Exactly. I think it's important for people to understand self doesn't fix things for you. It helps you think about the most critical things you got to do in order to fix the problem.
And that's why I think it's so helpful too when we think about it in terms of the supervisory or management relationships. Um, and I said before, it's the grid. When you think about it as a grid, and it has S, E, L, and F, and then the three areas where we know there are parallels, right? Service focused, staff focused, and team focused. We can pick any of them, right? We can have a whole supervision that's just focused on one of those boxes. But at least it gives us some way of breaking out of that conversation about like, here are my updates, that very robotic
Yeah.
reporting, stuff that you could send in an email. It's also a way, I think, for staff to assert what they need and direct the process of the conversation. It's also helpful, I think, as a supervisor, because it means I don't have to like read between the lines to get at, the staff focused stuff or team or organization focused stuff. There are prompts that people can use to bring it up themselves. We're reinforcing trauma informed language in the acronym self. Um, we also, are able to, I think, look for patterns, and that's really helpful, right? If the person that you're managing kind of focuses on the same thing every single time you're meeting, that's good information. And it sort of gives us an opportunity to say, we might need to bump up, our conversations about emotion management, loss, or future. There's structure that we use also that I think is really important.
Yeah, the first part of the structure is going into any kind of management conversation with a collaborative agenda, right? That what we're trying to do is not me tell you what to do, but creating a partnership and sharing power in making and building decisions. And then we want to start with a strength-based approach, really focus on, well, what are we already doing that's working? What are our successes, right? And then end with defining next steps. What do we got to do? And that promotes accountability on everybody's part, because you want to get away from those constant complaining about the same things that never change. That's both a failure of management and a failure of the managee. It's everybody's failure. And it's important to get away from that.
Yeah, that part about starting with successes, I think, the people I supervise probably hate me for it, but I often will start with, all right, so what do we want to cover? What's important? What's at the top of your list today? And then I'll say, but before we jump into that, I want to hear a moment of brilliance. Tell me about something that you did that, you feel really good about this week. And it's so uncomfortable, but I feel like it's also so important to push.
Yep.
Because we really need to seize any opportunity we can to highlight strengths. It also helps prevent vicarious trauma when we are
Right.
able to celebrate good work.
Right. It is amazing how often there are environments where no brags are allowed.
Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about each of the letters of self and kind of put them into categories when we talk about teams. So if we talk about team focused safety, what we want to look at is the strengths or the concerns. So are there policy concerns or issues around moral safety? That's hugely important. But it also may be things like workload, case assignments, documentation, keeping up with notes, for the compliance officer, and then cultural safety, cultural differences within the team that's actually affecting the work and may not be well understood. And then if we keep a team focused on the E for emotions, we want to look at team dynamics. How are we doing with collaborating with each other? What has really worked? What about workload or assignments? How are people feeling about that? What about interdepartmental collaboration? Is that happening? Interagency collaboration, right? What's going on around that? When the team is focused on loss, then we're going to be thinking about like impending changes, staff departures, staff changes, reassignments, changes in the program, or these days, a lot of program consolidation and insecurity, and policy and practice changes. And if we're doing team focused future, then we're looking at opportunities for growth, opportunities of all sorts of service expansion, program redesign, any suggestions for program improvements. All of those all focused on the conversations as a whole team.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have some examples that I think can illustrate some of this. And one is, a compassionate conversation about some administrative tasks, right? When I work with clinicians, there is tendency to need to focus on the documentation, right? Their notes are late. So are mine. But having those conversations in the context of safety, right? Like this is an organizational safety issue. It's about our financial safety and it's about risk management. If our notes are not in on time, and something happens, there isn't that documentation that, demonstrates that we've actually done what we were supposed to do. And so it's offered some, opportunities to have conversations about solutions, right? Instead of just being like, okay, I have to have a performance conversation about your notes. This gives us an opportunity to talk about why it's important, but also think about, okay, so, what can we do instead? Do you need to not schedule people back to back? Do you need to change your schedule to give yourself 15 minutes in the beginning and at the end of the day? Do you need skill building on how to do it quickly and efficiently? Or is this really about resistance? Do you not see the value, right? So this one thing, the notes not being on time, typically the conversation is like, okay, get your notes in on time or you're going to get written up.
Right.
But using the framework of safety, emotions, loss, and future allows us to talk about it really differently. Another example was around someone not taking vacation. This person, and this is from one of the agencies that I'm coaching, there was a person who had gobs of vacation time stored up, and the supervisor was like, okay, you have to take some vacation time. You have to take vacation time. And then they'd come in and a month later and like still hadn't taken any vacation time. And the self framework really allowed for a conversation about loss. And this person shared that, she was the only person in her family who was living in this country. And she really felt like being at work was a good distraction. And taking time away meant she didn't have anyone to really interact with. And that shifted the conversation, right?
Yeah,
so it
sure.
wasn't just about like, you need to do this, check the box. This was an opportunity to see what the barriers were. I'll share too. I mean, for me, when I think back to some of the ways that I have used self as a clinician myself, I think about, in October, it was the anniversary of my dad's passing. And I was working with a patient who was putting her mom in hospice care. And so when I was meeting with my supervisor, that was something I needed to talk about because I avoid things. Sandy, I'm an avoider. Oh, yeah. So I knew that I had to have this conversation about what was coming up for me, about my own loss with my own dad, so that it wouldn't interfere with my work with this particular person. And also, in October, we had conversations about a policy concern. And through the course of that conversation, I actually was able to brainstorm with my manager and we came up with a solution together and brought it forward. So that really shifted for me also. So lots of ways to use the self framework, and I hope for our listeners that you will find even more ways to take this and run with it. Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week. Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to lead in a trauma-informed organization. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.
Bye-bye, everybody.